I'm so glad Star Trek realized it wasn't too late to fix TNG's two biggest romance mistakes. For a show that prided itself on optimism, emotional intelligence, and the long view of human progress, Star Trek, The Next Generation was strangely timid when it came to romance. It flirted with intimacy, teased deep connections, and laid unmistakable emotional groundwork, only to pull away at the last second, afraid of commitment. In hindsight, TNG didn't just mishandle love stories. It froze them in stasis, leaving two of its most meaningful relationships unresolved for decades. Those two mistakes were clear even before the series finale faded to black. Jean-Luc Picard and Beverly Crusher never truly got their chance, and William Riker and Deanna Troi were separated for far too long in the name of episodic convenience. What's remarkable, and genuinely heartening, is that Star Trek eventually realized it didn't have to live with those missteps forever. Through later films and especially Star Trek, Picard, the franchise went back, reopened old emotional wounds, and finally allowed these characters to grow into the relationships they'd been circling since the late 1980s. It didn't erase the frustration of waiting so long, but it did something rarer and braver. It admitted that the story wasn't finished. The Picard/Crusher problem. When subtext became a cage. From the very first season of The Next Generation, Jean-Luc Picard and Beverly Crusher were written with romantic tension so obvious it practically hummed through the Enterprise's corridors. Their shared history, Jack Crusher's death, Picard's guilt, Beverly's complicated grief, gave them a depth few television romances even attempt. This wasn't a workplace flirtation. It was a relationship shaped by loss, restraint, and mutual respect. And then, nothing happened. For 7 seasons, Picard and Crusher danced around each other with longing glances, loaded pauses, and episodes that came tantalizingly close to breaking the dam. The Naked Now teased it, attached, all but confirmed it. All Good Things showed us a possible future where they finally married, then yanked it away as a hypothetical. The problem wasn't that TNG lacked chemistry. It was that the show treated romance as a threat to Picard's authority and to the series' pristine professionalism. Picard, especially, was locked into a narrative box. The emotionally restrained captain, married to Starfleet itself. Letting him choose love felt, to the writers, like diminishing his mythic status. In reality, it diminished him by denying him growth. By the end of TNG, Picard was one of television's most fully realized captains, and yet emotionally unfinished. Crusher, meanwhile, was reduced to an eternal, almost. Her desires perpetually deferred for the sake of Picard's image. Their relationship became a symbol of TNG's greatest romantic flaw, the belief that longing was more interesting than fulfillment. Why avoiding resolution was the wrong call. Television in the late 80s and early 90s had a deep fear of happily ever after. Writers worried that once a couple got together, the story would lose tension. So TNG kept Picard and Crusher in permanent orbit around each other, mistaking stasis for sophistication. But what the show failed to recognize was that TNG was uniquely suited to explore an established, mature relationship. Picard and Crusher weren't impulsive 20-somethings. They were adults with careers, responsibilities, and emotional scars. Watching them navigate love alongside command decisions and ethical dilemmas could have added richness, not robbed the show of it. Instead, their romance was preserved like an artifact behind glass, admired, never touched. That's why the eventual course correction matters so much. Star Trek didn't just revive their connection. It reframed it as something that had been real all along, even if unfulfilled. Riker and Troi. The breakup that never made sense. If Picard and Crusher were a romance defined by restraint, Riker and Troi were undone by indecision. From Encounter at Farpoint, the show established that these two had a past. Not just a flirtation, but a serious, emotionally significant relationship. They knew each other deeply. They trusted each other implicitly. They shared a psychic bond that no other couple on the Enterprise could match. And yet, despite being clearly in love, they were written as exes who never quite got back together. The rationale was always flimsy. Riker needed freedom. Troi needed independence. Starfleet regulations might complicate things, but episode after episode showed them choosing each other emotionally, while the script insisted they stay romantically apart. The result was a relationship that felt less like a mature breakup and more like narrative procrastination. Worse, TNG often used Troy's love life as a dumping ground for forgettable guest stars, while Riker accumulated flings that never meant much. Their bond remained the emotional constant, even as the show pretended it wasn't leading anywhere. By the time the series ended, it felt less like a choice and more like an oversight. Star Trek. Nemesis tried, and almost failed, to fix it. When Star Trek Nemesis finally married Riker and Troy, it should have felt triumphant. Instead, it was rushed, underdeveloped, and oddly perfunctory. The wedding happened because the franchise was running out of time, not because the story had earned the moment. Still, it mattered. For the first time, Star Trek acknowledged that keeping Riker and Troy apart indefinitely had been a mistake. Their marriage validated years of subtext and emotional continuity. It said, quietly but firmly, that these characters weren't stuck in a perpetual holding pattern anymore. But Nemesis didn't give us the emotional payoff the relationship deserved. It was a checkbox, not a celebration. The real healing would come much later. How Star Trek Picard finally understood the assignment. It took more than 20 years, but Star Trek Picard did what TNG never quite dared to do. It treated unresolved romances as emotional truths, not dangling threads to be ignored. Picard and Crusher's relationship was no longer played as a what if. It was framed as a love that had existed, mattered, and left consequences. Their shared son wasn't a retcon. It was an acknowledgement that intimacy had happened off-screen in the quiet spaces TNG refused to explore. Their reunion wasn't about rekindling youthful passion. It was about reckoning with regret, fear, and the cost of emotional avoidance. Most importantly, Picard was finally allowed to admit that choosing Starfleet over love had been a choice, not destiny. That distinction transformed his character. He wasn't the tragic, untouchable captain anymore. He was a man confronting the limits of his own restraint. Riker and Troy, meanwhile, were depicted as something television rarely shows well. A long married couple shaped by joy and devastating loss. Their relationship in Picard felt lived in, imperfect, and profoundly human. They had weathered grief together, nearly broken under it, and found their way back. This wasn't romance as ideal. It was romance as endurance. And it worked. Why fixing these mistakes actually strengthened TNG. What's remarkable is how retroactively right these fixes feel. They don't undermine the next generation. They complete it. Picard's emotional distance now reads as tragic rather than noble, a flaw, not a virtue. Crusher's patience becomes strength, not passivity. Riker and Troy's prolonged separation transforms from narrative dithering into the story of two people who needed time to grow into the same future. By addressing these romances later, Star Trek honored something essential about its universe. People don't stop evolving just because a series ends. Lives continue. Feelings deepen. Regrets linger. In a franchise obsessed with continuity, this kind of emotional follow-through matters just as much as canon dates and starship registries. Why it was worth the wait. Even if it shouldn't have taken so long, were these mistakes frustrating at the